Hey, good afternoon or good evening whenever you're watching our very special Fireside Chat edition, the first of its kind for this year on the Civil War. Now, as I mentioned in class, this is going to be a little bit longer version, so I hope you guys have your pens and notepads ready to go here. And by covering this material tonight on the Fireside Chat, it's going to actually allow us to get into a much more philosophical, a much more spirited debate, hopefully tomorrow, on some of the more controversial moves that Abraham Lincoln pulled off as commander-in-chief during the Civil War. And it's going to tie into some of the battles that I talk about here on today's version of the Fireside Chat. Also, recall what I said about the reading quiz this week. The contents of today's Fireside Chat are quizzable for that last assessment before the new year. So here we go. We know from class that the war broke out in 1861, and the first Battle of Bull Run, or the Battle of Manassas, was really a pivotal moment where both sides sort of realized that they were going to have to dig in, and that the war was not going to be over swiftly, as many had predicted. Immediately, the Union turned to one of its older, more storied generals who didn't see any action in the Civil War on the battlefields. However, as a former war hero from the Mexican-American War and Whig Party candidate for the presidency, Winfield Scott, right, he was the kind of Jabba the Hutt-like character that we joked about in class. Winfield Scott became sort of the architect of Northern strategy, Union strategy in fighting the Civil War. And Scott devised a strategy that the Union would attempt to utilize really throughout the rest of the war. And the plan became known as the Anaconda Plan. That was the nickname given to Winfield Scott's strategy. And I tell you about Winfield Scott's strategy because in a way we've actually already talked about the advantages and disadvantages that each side had going to war. Well, one that we haven't discussed at all is the decisive advantage that the North had as far as the Navy. The southern states had no built-up Navy whatsoever, since the bulk of the Navy was already under federal control before the war. So the southern states had to quickly scramble to provide itself some sort of a Navy, and the Union would take full advantage of this. And part one of Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, there's three parts. Part one was to really blockade the southern cities. The North sought to completely cut off the South from any foreign trade and really make sure the South was under strict blockade during most of the war. And the key for Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, again, to pull it off, it really came down to making sure that the North took advantage of its decisive naval advantage. But just because the North had a decisive naval advantage doesn't mean that it was going to be easy to pull off. The South, as we talked about, was quite resolute in proving itself a worthy adversary. And speaking of the Navy, I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the more crucial naval battles of the Civil War. We often don't hear about naval battles within the Civil War because so much of it was really fought over land. But one of the key naval battles in the entire war was the Battle of Hampton Roads. And if you know anything about Civil War battles, you should know that this naval battle was the first of its kind in American history, mainly because it involved ships that were covered with iron. And the two sides, North and South, each had their own ironclad. That's what these ships were known as. And as far as military history is concerned, the ironclad battle that took place in the Battle of Hampton Roads between the two ironclads transformed naval warfare forever. I mean, this is going to be the dawn of a new era where now naval battles are going to be fought by stronger, more fortified ships, not so much your traditional wooden frigates that have been used throughout most of naval history. Now, the ironclads were unique because they were really one of a kind at this point in the war, but they issue a new proclamation, which is sort of, I don't mean a formal proclamation, but the idea, proclaiming that naval warfare is going to be transcending technology now. For the Civil War buffs out there, the northern ironclad, by the way, was called the Monitor, and the southern ironclad was called the Merrimac. And the Monitor versus the Merrimac did battle in Hampton Roads, where arguably, again, naval warfare was changing forever. Ultimately, it was the North, the Monitor, that exacted damage upon its foe, the Merrimac, which had to be retired. And the North would continue to utilize this advantage of a superior navy throughout the war, and more ironclads were built. And when these two ships did battle here in 1862, early 1862, the rest of the world took notice. So from a naval standpoint, the Battle of Hampton Roads ushered in a completely new era of naval technology, naval warfare, and that's going to be pivotal as the world, not just the United States, but the world, sets its sights on imperialism, global imperialism, at the end of the 1800s. So always think of the Battle of Hampton Roads as really a transformative battle as far as taking naval technology, naval warfare tactics, and totally having to reinvent the wheel, basically, in order to now accommodate this crushing new technology that was built during the Civil War era. Now, while the Battle of Hampton Roads was taking place on the east coast of America, the North also set its sights on capturing the all-important port, the southern port of New Orleans. And the capture of New Orleans took place in the spring of 1862. From a strategic standpoint, capturing the city of New Orleans with naval force was pivotal to not only part one of Winfield Scott's Anaconda plan, but also part two, which was for the North to seize the Mississippi River. It goes without saying the importance of the Mississippi River in North American history, crucial. But in the war, if the North could control the Mississippi, you have to sort of take a look at a map here, and you can imagine how that would just be a decisive blow in cutting the South off. Western territories, such as Arizona, for example, western states, such as Missouri, would be completely choked off. Although Missouri was a border state, it still had a number of Confederate sympathizers and Copperheads. And by choking off the Mississippi, you also take out Texas from the Confederate states. So capturing the Mississippi was crucial. And to go after Mississippi, number one, the city of New Orleans had to be captured, which it was. So for the North, that was a tremendous accomplishment early in the war. Because once you take the city of New Orleans, you have open access to go up through the Gulf of Mexico and enter the Mississippi from the south. Now, making your way up north in the Mississippi was an arduous task because the South had built strongholds all throughout the South and along the Mississippi River. And not only was the path and the journey north up the river hard, you also had to fight your way through land. And so what starts to happen as part of Winfield Scott's Anaconda plan, American forces were going to sweep into the west, starting from the state of Tennessee. And it's there that some of the key early Western battles occur. And that's one thing I want you to keep in mind. The Civil War was really fought in two theaters. And the word theater, by the way, in warfare just means where the battles took place. So you've got the Western theater, and the goal in the Western theater was to capture the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, the Eastern theater would provide, we'll get into that momentarily. So let's just stick to the West right here. So by the spring of 1862, New Orleans is under siege and would soon be captured. The Anaconda plan calls for the capturing of the Mississippi, the blockade of the South. So land forces from the North begin to move west, and commanded by a young, controversial general, Ulysses S. Grant, and the Army of the Tennessee, that was what the name of the Union forces that swept west. Grant becomes sort of a folklore hero early in the Civil War because he proved to be prolific at capturing southern forts and demanding their surrender, earning Grant the nickname, which was kind of based on his initials. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. He became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant because he was able to get so many southern forts to surrender during his time. But no battle that General Grant commanded forces at was more pivotal to the North's goal of capturing the Mississippi winning the Western Theater, then the Battle of Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh took place over 2 days in early April 1862, and it was in Shiloh, Tennessee. Now, if the First Battle of Bull Run had highlighted just how bloody and ferocious the fighting was going to be, Shiloh put that battle, really made it pale in comparison. Shiloh was a destructive battle in terms of loss of life, thousands of casualties on both sides. Absolutely just a cataclysmic battle. 2 days, it produced 23,000 casualties on both sides. 23,000. At the time, it was the bloodiest battle in American history. 23,000 casualties in 2 days. Most of the casualties were endured by the North on day one, when the constant barrage of Southern shells were penetrating the Union lines, and the battle was fought within the dense forests of western Tennessee. So just imagine, shrapnel and artillery exploding and trees exploding, and it just created a just horrific, bloody slaughter, really, for the North on day one. And there's a story about Grant commanding troops at Shiloh, and it's really where Grant kind of earned a lot of his reputation as a stalwart general, although it would take him a while to sort of work his way into Lincoln's favor. There's a story about Grant, who was, by the way, a prolific cigar smoker, which I don't condone, but Grant smoked cigars prolifically on the battlefield. And after day one, where the North was handed, it's just a terrible, terrible defeat on the first day, Grant and one of his commanders, William Sherman, we'll hear from more on him later in the war, Grant and Sherman were discussing the battle, and Sherman was quite apprehensive about the North's abilities to win the fight. And it's at that point that Grant, and the story goes, how much of this is actually identical to what really happened, is debatable. But Grant and Sherman were talking, and Grant smoking on a cigar. It's raining. It's nighttime. They're exhausted. Sherman's sort of apprehensive about, winning the fight the next day. And Grant at this point delivers one of my favorite lines about any Civil War battle. Sherman tells him that they really were hit hard, and it's looking very bleak the next day. And Grant, allegedly, according to the story, puffing on a cigar, turns to Sherman and just utters very simple words that you may have noticed have been hanging in my classroom all year. I've yet to allude to why. But at that point, Grant allegedly turns to Sherman and says, "Yes, that's true, but we'll lick 'em tomorrow." And I just have always enjoyed that story, because, in fact, the North did go on to lick, which is just really a verb for like beat or hit hard or whatever, not in the sort of perverse way that you may be thinking. And for me, that quote has become something I've used over the years just to remind students that, on any given day, you can have a horrible day like the North did the first day of Shiloh, but then there's always the next day. And so Grant and the Union and others would prevail in winning a key battle that allowed Grant and his forces to keep moving towards capturing key forts along the Mississippi. And Grant, this is really where he would stamp out his reputation as a calculated, confident, collected leader on the battlefield, and it's going to propel him to greatness later in the war. So Shiloh is a key victory in the Western campaign. Let's kind of change things over to the Eastern campaign, where things weren't going very well for Lincoln and the Union. Now, in the East, as we talked about, the South had the definite advantage as far as military leadership is concerned. And that's where General Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson just began to showcase their genius on the battlefield. Lee, who eventually assumed command of the Confederate force, all Confederate forces in the East, Lee was a West Point graduate, a revered general. Even before the Civil War, he was well known. He was the guy who captured John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Before the war, Lee served his state. He was a Virginian, and so he took the responsibility of coordinating the South's strategy. Now, Lee took matters into his own hands early in 1862 in the spring and summer, and he launched an aggressive offensive to strike at Washington, D.C. The South were going for a quick home run here in the war by the summer of 1862, and their plan was to capture D.C. Now, if the North had captured, if the South had captured Washington, D.C., well, who would have known? That was their strategy. Meanwhile, the Union was sort of forced into a precarious situation because part 3 of Winfield Scott's plan, 1 was the blockade, 2 was the capturing the Mississippi, part 3 was to capture the capital of the South, which had moved from Alabama up to Richmond, Virginia. So while Lee is about to strike an offensive, the North was also trying to launch a counteroffensive into the South to capture Richmond, but that was going brutally for the North. And their leader, George McClellan. George McClellan was the commander of Union forces early in the war, and he sort of drew the consternation of Abraham Lincoln. McClellan, who had a reputation for being an amazing logistical commander, great trainer of troops, great logistics, great planner, great at coordinating supplies and routing railroads. But in fact, it's McClellan who had a reputation for being a slow tacticianer on the battlefield. And McClellan and Lee, the forces would do battle all throughout the spring and summer of 1862. And there's numerous battles where Lee just consistently ran circles around his northern counterparts. But ultimately, it was going to be the Battle of Antietam in 1862, September of 1862, that changed forever the course of the war. It's an early turning point in the war because as we hit September, like I mentioned, Robert E. Lee was crushing Union forces everywhere he could, and Lee was mounting an offensive to get to Washington, D.C. Antietam, which was fought near Sharpsburg, Maryland, was not that far outside of D.C., so Lee was really going for the jugular here. Now, part of the story that's always surrounded the Battle of Antietam is how the North found out about Lee's plans to attack at Sharpsburg. A Union scout, who's someone who rides ahead of the army and surveys and looks for to gather intelligence, kind of like a reconnaissance officer in the Marine Corps does today. A Union scout came across a cigar box that he found, and the cigar box had inside of it plans and Confederate troop movements all throughout Maryland. And this was a massively important piece of information, or group pieces of information, I should say, that the North could have utilized to its advantage. However, McClellan sort of balked a little bit. He didn't utilize the plans as much as he could have, and instead, whereas the North, some historians, military historians, believe the North could have launched some sort of quick strike on the South, given the intelligence they gathered through the cigar box, McClellan sort of hesitates. And that will become a theme for McClellan throughout his tenure as commander in the Civil War. He was very hesitant to make decisions and to take decisive action, as we'll talk about later when I finish the story of Antietam. Now, Antietam, with all due respect to Shiloh or any other battle up to its point, Antietam was truly a harbinger of the destructive nature of the Civil War. And I know I talked about in class, my old 8th grade teacher, Mr. Paul, who in covering the Civil War used to remind us that one of the reasons for such incredibly high casualty rates in battles like Shiloh, in battles like Antietam, was the theme that technology was ahead of the tactics. The technology of the Civil War was so far advanced compared to the tactics of just bum rushing the other side that at battles like Antietam, the body count stacked up just at ungodly rates. In fact, Antietam will go down as the single bloodiest day in American military history. 23,000 men approximately were either killed or wounded at Antietam in one day. It was a one-day battle. Shiloh was over 2 days. Antietam was in 1 day. So all the carnage of Shiloh was at 1 day in Maryland. And ultimately, the battle, which raged throughout a myriad of different areas in sort of the farmlands of Maryland, the battle raged throughout the day, and just thousands upon thousands were forever scarred, both in life and in death, by Antietam. Lee was not able to penetrate the northern lines, so this was a really big victory for the North in that regard. Lee didn't get to Washington. His forces were not successful moving past the North. So in that case, McClellan and his soldiers held their ground. However, historians are not so quick to attribute a complete victory for the North because of the fact that after the battle, McClellan hesitated. There's one of the themes I mentioned that you'll hear about McClellan. He hesitated in chasing Lee and sort of landing a decisive knockout punch. McClellan did not regroup troops, and nor did he attempt to drive Lee back and put Lee on the defensive. Instead, McClellan balked, did not chase Lee out of Maryland, and Lee was able to escape with whatever forces he had remaining intact and regroup for another fight. And this drew the ire of Abraham Lincoln, who became very loathsome of George McClellan and his leadership tactics. And shortly after Antietam, Lincoln would actually have McClellan fired as the commander of the Northern forces in the Eastern Theater. So in that respect, you could argue that Antietam was somewhat of a failure for the North because it didn't destroy Lee and his forces. But nonetheless, Washington, D.C. was safe and sound for the time being. And as close as Lee got, it really actually instituted reforms in D.C., and Congress quickly snapped into action and demanded the construction of numerous roadblocks, and massive trenches were dug outside of D.C. to protect the Union capital. And in fact, throughout the war, a lot of government business was moved out of Washington, D.C. up to West Point just to ensure that if D.C. was ever attacked, it would remain safe and sound. But the Battle of Antietam, while we can look at it as sort of a difficult call here, is it a win? Is it not a win? The one thing that Antietam should always be remembered for, along with the lives of the men who lost and fought dying there, the victory would give Abraham Lincoln cause to issue just mere days after Antietam an executive order that would change forever the Civil War. And on that note, I'm going to sort of pause things here, and we're going to set things up for tomorrow. I hope you know what I'm alluding to, but that's going to be the Emancipation Proclamation. The Northern victory at Antietam, no doubt, gave Abraham Lincoln cause and justification for issuing what he perceived to be the game changer in all of the Civil War, which was giving the Northern military the authority from the commander-in-chief that when they invaded the South, to free African-American slaves. We're going to take a look at the document, the Emancipation Proclamation, tomorrow in class. And once again, we're going to frame the question about how Abraham Lincoln extended his power of the presidency. And really, was he extending the presidency in issuing this military order? So that's what's really going to be on tap for tomorrow. We're going to also talk about African-American involvement in the war, how African-Americans participated extensively for the North, much in part thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation. But we'll also look at how the Emancipation was challenged in the South, and that should give us a broader perspective on the Emancipation for tomorrow. So I did get this done in under 30 minutes, so you're welcome. But it is longer, and I just, again, want to reiterate that we are, in fact, going to have material from this quiz, or from this discussion quizzed on this week. So I'll leave you guys with that for today. A lot to digest about the war in 1862. Make sure you guys bring some questions if you have any tomorrow. And for the rest of you, or for the rest of your Sunday, have a great day. And remember, the past shapes the future. Take care.